RS-25 engines lit. 4, 3, 2, 1. Booster ignition. And liftoff.
Hello and welcome to Space Now, the space news podcast from the National Space Centre that goes beyond the headlines. I'm David Southworth.
And I'm Josh Barker.
Now we have a special edition for you today, talking all about the Artemis II launch. It happened late last night. It is currently early on the morning of the 2nd of April, so we're both a little bit sleepy.
A little bit.
Josh, I think I know the answer. Did you watch the launch?
Nah, I thought I'd go to sleep. No, of course I watched it. It's the most historic mission probably of my lifetime, I think. So yeah, I did stay up and watch it. How about yourself?
Yeah, I did. I suspect you're more of a space nerd about things like this than me. That you probably
guilty
watch a
as
lot of
charged.
launches.
I do try to watch a lot, although nowadays there's so many, it's difficult to keep up.
Obviously I'm interested in space. That's why I work at the National Space Centre. That's why I'm really interested in this podcast. But I don't tend to watch launches live. So this was kind of a new thing for me. I was really interested in this one.
Excellent. Did you enjoy it?
I did. I didn't watch that much. I started watching about 45 minutes before the initial the due time for launch.
Yeah, well, you could have started a lot earlier than that. I think I noticed about lunchtime. I think they put the start of the fueling up, so maybe people at home perhaps tuned into that. Not much happened other than watching a rocket on a launch pad slowly fill with fuel. But I think about an hour before was probably a good point.
I started watching it then and watched through the actual launch for about 15 minutes and then realised I needed to get some sleep.
Yeah, I was the same. I think I managed about half an hour after takeoff just to see the first few major milestones, but then the mission sort of splits up.
So, a question for you with that context. Your experience watching launches, was there anything, apart from the significance of it in your mind, and I agree with that totally, was there anything about this launch that felt materially different from previous launches that you've watched?
I think, like you say, I think a lot of this launch comes down to that historical significance. You know, it's the first time that we're sending people out to the moon in over 50 years. You know, we have the amazing Apollo missions, but this is a real step change in us doing this and pursuing this goal of exploring the moon a lot further. So I think, like you say, that was obviously the key part of this mission. Thankfully, in terms of as rocket launchers go, it was pretty textbook, and I think
smooth, wasn't it?
It was super smooth. And I think sometimes you expect excitement, expect drama. We've had recent years of test rockets exploding after launch. Thankfully, that didn't happen, especially with people on board. But I think that was I think what stood out was just how smooth, how professional, how calm, and I think really showcasing this is NASA, who are one of the most prolific and one of the most experienced space agencies in the world, doing what they do best. They've spent a long time getting this project to this point. They know exactly what's going to happen. Many people might remember back when we had the delay, about a month or so ago, and everyone was disappointed, and it was like, it's just a fueling issue. It's like, no.
That's what it's built in.
This is what we do. And in fact, people may have even spotted that there was a couple of issues. So they, quite early on, probably about the time you tuned in, if you tuned in about an hour, they tracked a problem with what they call the launch abort system, which is the tower on the top. And that's to keep them safe. So at any point, once they start the rocket going, or just before, they need to be able to get astronauts to safety.
And that, the general point you're making about minor glitches, or rather not glitches, but minor possible short delays, technical issues they need to just quickly sort out. That's one of the things I found very interesting. And again, this is from a slightly different perspective from yours, not used to watching launches. And it was very open. You had access to the full chat. And so some of those little things, seeing that being solved, or at least discussed, going through the procedures in real time and understanding some of that stuff a bit more than I've ever seen before, was really, really interesting for me. What felt like, this sounds like a disaster. No, it's just a little minor thing. We're going through a process. This is the data we've received. Other teams have had something similar. They were talking about how long that glitch in the data had lasted. It's very short, nothing to worry about. We're back on track. I thought that was really, really interesting.
Yeah, I think that again, as the inner nerd in me, that I find that process fascinating. I think so you were talking about the it was that 10-minute hold, which was
a bit of a delay on that hold.
Yeah, and all that was a telemetry issue. So they were speaking to the spacecraft, and it dropped out. I think for something for like less than 10 seconds.
It was, and they were discussing how many cycles they could go with, and it could up to 30 seconds.
Yeah, they needed, if it broke for 3 samples, so 30 seconds, then that would have been the cutoff of something's wrong.
Something to do with
and I think, amusingly, you even heard, I think, like the lady declared that there was this issue, and the second sentence was like, well, does it hit the goal? And she was like, no, so I don't think it's an issue, but we need to work through this problem. And then you heard, like you say, really openly, them go through, speak to the procedures, let's double check, let's make sure everything's okay. And then we had that fantastic moment, which is always great, which was the go-no calls. Yeah, and it's that nice, and I think, like you say, it's that openness, which I think you get from places like NASA and these feeds. And that's something that, you know, like say I watch a lot of rocket launches and you get to see, and I think that always reminds me, we always think it's the rocket and those 4 brave astronauts sat at the top, but what you don't see in those live streams is the hundreds, if not thousands of people that are frantically and very nervously monitoring systems and sensors and everything to make sure that's processed. And I think those little insights are really nice to be like,
really
this
are.
is such a team effort. It's such a well-oiled, well-rehearsed machine that any little issue they are going to hold. They're going to figure out. They're going to work out what's going on.
Procedures.
Yeah, which I think is
interestingly, I heard a few people yesterday, including Jared Isaacman, the administrator of NASA, including the astronauts, acknowledging the massive teams behind this. We've gone straight into real space geek chat now. I think we should maybe pull back a bit. What's the purpose of the Artemis missions? Let's go wider. We're going back to the moon. We haven't done it for over 50 years.
Correct.
And it felt, I think, to a lot of people like, we did that. Why are we doing it again?
So I think the point is that we did do that, and we got some amazing science data. We got some amazing technology lessons from the Apollo missions. In fact, we're still learning from them. You know, still to this day, there are samples that were collected during the Apollo missions that are still sealed, awaiting for inventions and new technology, ready to analyze those. But it's 50 years ago. Things have moved on. Our priorities have changed. Our understanding has changed. And interestingly, our priorities changed. People always ask, whenever I've spoken about the Apollo missions, well, why did we stop going to the moon? And it was because we decided we wanted to focus on other things. You know, NASA...
Budget comes into it a lot. Of
course, budget
expensive.
came into it, but also focus on other things. So the shuttle took over the Apollo era, and that was designed to make space accessible, and that never quite got to exactly what it wanted to do. It was an amazing machine, delivered amazing science and amazing missions, but that was a focus of, let's try and make getting into space super easy, let's build a space station, let's do that. And now we're seeing those priorities shift. You know, the space station has not run its life, there's still a lot more we can do, but we've done that for 25 years. What's next? And the moon is the next step, which is actually laying the groundwork for further exploration as well.
Potentially Mars, which is something a lot of people have talked about. Also interesting, I think, in that it's a bit different this time.
Yeah.
In the 60s, it was very much about the space race, trying to beat the Soviets to the moon. This time, there's an element of that. China and India have both talked about wanting to go to the moon, put astronauts on the moon. Russia have as well, although they have possibly economic issues at the moment, which might make that a bit harder for them currently. But this time, as you said, we are looking potentially at longer-term goals. It's not just a race, can we be the first? This time, NASA is looking at building a moon base.
Yeah, which is a really interesting development because they weren't originally.
No, so they were. We've talked on this podcast several times about the Lunar Gateway, which we thought was the part that the space station they were planning to build orbiting the moon. That's now been shelved, and they're focusing more on building a lunar base. But that's still a long-term project. It's still, I don't just mean in terms of it'll take a while to happen. It's looking to the future.
Yeah.
We're trying to learn about living on another celestial object. We're trying to learn about the challenges and how we can overcome those, potentially building up to taking people to Mars. So although it feels a little bit like a last-minute knee-jerk reaction almost from our perspective, NASA very recently announced they were shelving Lunar Gateway and focusing on the base. It's still part, I think, of the wider program, the wider intention of building on this and going forwards.
Yeah, and I think interestingly, that was always the plan in Europe. So when the original Lunar Gateway plans from NASA came out, alongside that, the European Space Agency said, well, that works because we're focusing on building a lunar base. So they've been doing experiments on turning the lunar soil into concrete so they can make the base while they're there. So they've been really working in the background on those sorts of technologies and those sorts of procedures. And so it does, like you say, it seems almost like it kind of out of the blue from NASA. But actually, as a space industry as a whole, we've kind of been working towards that. And I think this is just perhaps an understanding from NASA under Jared Isaacman's new leadership that maybe this base has some advantages, but actually maybe it's a bit easier. There are other advantages and, different cons and drawbacks to just taking that hardware. And that's literally what they're doing. They're taking the hardware, and instead of having it orbit around the moon, they're just going to land it on the moon. Yeah. So most of the hardware is kind of already there, so it might not take as long as we think.
A few tweaks.
Yeah, you've got to install a front door rather than an airlock or whatever. Well, no, you need an airlock for the moon, but welcome that maybe.
Something else I want to pick up on, actually, you mentioned something in there which I think is very important to stress on the Artemis missions. It's not just NASA working on its own. They're working quite similar to the International Space Station minus the Russians. They're working with the Canadian Space Agency. There's a Canadian astronaut, Jeremy Hansen, on this mission. They're working with the European Space Agency, with JAXA, the Japanese Space Agency. So it is a much more multinational cooperative effort than the last time. Let's talk about Artemis II and its place in this wider program. So we've talked briefly there about the wider aims of the Artemis program, and we've immediately jumped to we are going to land people back on the moon. Not happening with Artemis II.
No.
So where does it sit in the wider plan for the Artemis missions?
So Artemis 2 is to test the human-rated capabilities of the spacecraft that will get us to the moon.
Because Artemis 1 flew already about 3.5 years ago without people on board.
Yeah, that was a fully automated mission, which, interestingly, this mission was also pretty much fully automated, but we need crew because we want to send crew there, and the crew have had some moments to interject and are, of course, on hand should something go wrong. But interestingly, it's a real marriage of automation, electronics, machinery doing an excellent job while also caring for its astronaut crew and allowing them to do some stuff as well. But yeah, this is really a test of, can the hardware get people into space? Can it keep them safe and alive in space? Can it get them to the moon? And can it return them safely as well? So this mission actually mirrors Apollo 8, which did exactly the same. Yeah, people may remember that back at home. But that was exactly what that did. That was to say, we've got this rocket, we've got a spacecraft that we think can do it, we've tested it, now let's make sure it can. Let's have a dress rehearsal of can we get there and back before we then move on to the next stages of taking people down to the surface. Because the last thing you want to do is stick some people on the surface of the moon and then realise, oh, the rocket we designed thought would work, doesn't quite work, and now they're stuck and stranded. So we didn't want that to happen.
So continuing your Apollo comparisons, this is Apollo 8, Artemis 2 is Apollo 8, Artemis 3 is going to be Apollo 9, basically, isn't it? Artemis 3 is going to be just in Earth orbit, but it's going to be testing all the docking and undocking procedures, interacting with the possible landing vehicles.
Yep, that's right.
One from SpaceX, one from Blue Origin, I
think.
Correct,
yeah.
And then Artemis 4, hopefully in 2028, should be Apollo 11. That should be the next moon landing.
Yeah, that's the plan. So we'll see. But I think what's important is that's a nice schedule and a nice lofty goal. We've got 10 days now where this spacecraft is going to be tested and monitored, and then we'll see what happens. And then there'll be a whole set of debriefing. Interestingly, Jared Isaacman said as soon as this launch is taken off, the mobile launch pad is heading back in and they're going to start stacking for the next mission. Yeah. I think that's a nice lofty goal. The realistic side of this is that they are going to spend a lot of time analysing this data, working out, because there'll be things that won't necessarily have gone wrong, but perhaps didn't behave as expected, behave better or slightly worse, and they'll have to work their way through again, like we saw them work through those problems during launch, to make sure everything is absolutely perfect. I mentioned right at the start that we see lots of these rocket launches, and people at home that follow rocket launches know that, I think it's like a rocket launch, I think it's every other day at the moment.
Something like that,
You get so many, and it almost feels routine, but it's always a reminder it isn't routine. Yeah. This is still one of the hardest things that we as a species are attempting. It's an incredibly hostile environment, incredibly powerful machinery that just the slightest issue can cause absolute disaster, and making sure things are perfect, and I mean perfect, is something that these teams are super laser focused on, and so there will be a lot of prep. But if everything goes well, if they've done their homework, everything's prepared, then that 2028 goal, so far, looking at the performance of the rocket, seems like it might be potentially achievable.
Talking about everything needing to be perfect, maybe we should talk about a launch window, because people may have seen it's been in the news quite a lot. It's been a much more high profile launch, this, as you might expect, than most rocket launches. But one of the main issues that's been in the news is the launch window, because we had a launch window at the start of February for a few days, which was missed, another one at the start of March, which was missed, and another one at the start of April, which luckily they've succeeded, 1st of April. Why is that so important? Why is it only a few days? What caused them to miss those launch windows? You've said already it's routine. We've talked about the testing. Can you tell us a bit more about why there's that narrow launch window and why the tests led to them being delayed? Yeah,
so the launch windows are there essentially because you've got to get to somewhere, and things move. We see the moon drifting across the night sky. If you set out every night, you'll notice that the moon changes position. It's because it's physically moving in space. And so when you want to make plans to getting to places, you have to launch when it's in the right place. But there's also other things as well. So for example, if you were paying attention to the stream last night, they mentioned that there was a hold, I think about 2 hours after the launch window opened. Yes. So the main window was open for quite a while, I think this one, a couple of days, but there was a big gap. And that gap in the middle, as a 2 hour break, was because there were satellites in the way.
Yeah.
They literally just had to wait for satellites to fly overhead and move out of the way. So launch windows are all about, we need to launch this rocket. We want to launch it efficiently because we've not necessarily got fuel to waste. So everything has to be in exactly the right position. And that's everything from things down on the ground, moving boats out of the way for landing sites. It's the satellites in orbit around the Earth, but it's also then those celestial objects. And depending on where you go, can really focus those. So if people have watched previous missions, there was a mission that was heading off to Jupiter, the JUICE mission a couple of years ago, that I think that launch window was something like a second long.
Really?
Because it was literally that precise of, we can launch at this point, but if we don't launch at this point, by the time we've got everything in position to fire boosters, things will be so far out of position that it will take much more fuel to get there and the rocket can't do it. So Artemis was quite a generous, we can stick it on the launch pad. If we launch at any point within the next couple of days, we'll probably be okay. Obviously, it's not quite that. You can't have your astronauts out there that long. But it depends, and that's what changes. And so
the main purpose of the launch window is basically when the moon is lined up in the right place for the trajectory we're planning for it to all tie in nicely.
Yeah, so that's exactly what's the case across there. Make sure everything's okay. And that luckily all went to plan. That was exactly what we hoped, and had everything in there. But these launch windows can change. You mentioned that launch windows, often fall apart, things like that, and that can be again due to making sure things are in the right place. So depending on what issues are and what they have. So we mentioned that 10-minute hold. That was actually pre-planned.
Yes.
So in launch countdowns, you have this planned where you can say, at this point we'll have done these tests and we might need to hold to double check on certain sets of data.
Question for you there: the 10-minute hold I know there's a few points they can hold. They can choose. I know they can choose a 6-minute hold as well. There's a few points they can do that. The 10-minute hold, I got the impression that was always going to be a hold, or is that not the case? Is it that it could have gone straight through?
I think it almost certainly was. I think that would, like you say, I think that was a pre-planned.
Okay, so there's always
we're just
going to
hold, and they will
just to finalise preparations.
And especially with new missions. So this is, we mentioned that Artemis 1 flew a little while ago. This is still a relatively new rocket. This is not one that's launched.
It's second launch.
Yeah, it's not one that's launched a whole bunch and we know how it works. They will often build these planned holds in, which are, let's check, let's get everything to a certain point, double check everything, and then we'll move on to the next
So again, it's
stage.
your point about everything has to be perfect. Everyone has to be prepared. Coming back to the point I asked about why we missed the February and March launch windows, that was to do with a kind of a wider test almost, wasn't it? They did a thing called a wet dress rehearsal where they basically fuel up the rocket entirely. They take it to the launch pad, entirely fuel it up, check everything's working properly, drain the fuel back out. If that's all good to go, then they're ready for the launch window. And the one preparing for February, they found an issue with fuel, I think a small fuel leak, was it?
That's right, yeah.
So that was a failure of the wet dress rehearsal, so that's immediately, they cancelled the launch window. I think the March one, if I remember rightly, the wet dress rehearsal worked correctly, but as they were then draining the fuel, there was an issue with the helium that they use, I think, to keep things from being too combustible while they're draining. Is that correct?
They run a little helium flush just before they take off. So the engines, because of how powerful they are, because of how much energy they contain, if you've got things like pockets of air, which get very hot, they expand. It's essentially an explosion. Yeah. If you've got moisture, that can superheat to steam, and you can do the same sorts of things. So yeah, you're quite right. It takes so long to fuel these rockets that you get things like water vapor condenses out of the atmosphere, pockets of air and gas and water vapor get trapped, and that can cause massive issues. So once they're all fueled, they then flush it with helium, which is inert, and boils off really quickly to get rid of all of that. And yeah, you're quite right. There was an
small leak in that. So that time, what they decided was the wet dress rehearsal had been a success.
Yep.
The helium leak was a secondary issue, and that's why they didn't do a wet dress rehearsal for the April window. They would already sign that off. They fixed the helium issue, and that's why we were good to go for this one. So this time, we were just hoping for good weather. Is mainly.
I think that was the big major concern. Yeah, I think we're 80% good to go, and well, as we saw, it was all in. And I think that's always again fascinating. People don't often think about the weather, but it's a real big point, and it's a real major issue for human-rated missions because the weather doesn't have to just be right in the launch site. So many a time, if people remember watching things like shuttle launches and stuff like that, you often have glorious Florida weather, and then they're like, the weather's not right, we're going to cancel. And people are like, well, there's not a cloud in the sky, it's not raining, there's no wind, what's going on? But it's because in a human-rated mission, you have to have, I think it's like 5 or 6 emergency abort places.
Yes.
So it's several key points. So just after takeoff, there's a window for abort. There's also obviously a major issue around what's called max Q, which is when the rocket's under the most reduced aerodynamic stress, so stress from the atmosphere, that can be an issue when stages separate. And so they'll have around the globe, here are 6 locations that if we have to abort at this procedure, which is a high risk area, then this is where the crew will land. If we abort at this point, this is where the crew will land. And so not only do you have to check the weather at the launch site, you have to check the weather at all of those other sites, because you don't want there to be an issue and you have to abort and your crew are suddenly coming down in a torrential monsoon thunderstorm somewhere, and actually that's more of a risk than them getting away from the rocket safely. So that's why weather is such a big importance, and often is the undoing of many human-rated missions, especially compared to just robotic missions as well.
Okay, so I think we've covered a lot there about what the Artemis missions are hoping to achieve. We've covered a little bit about what Artemis II specifically is doing. I thought maybe we might deal with a few quick-fire, frequently asked questions, and questions that we've often got. Now, we have talked a bit about some of these, but what I'll do is I'll throw them at you.
Okay.
Give me a quick answer.
I'll panic slightly.
And I'll throw in a bit if I want to as well.
Marvellous.
So we've definitely talked a bit about this, but let's go with this quickly. Why is it important? Why is the Artemis mission important?
So the Artemis mission is really important because it establishes humanity's ability to get back to and explore the moon. And Artemis II is a really key testing ground to make sure all the hardware that we've built to do that can do its job and get us safely there.
Beautiful answer. One we've talked about before on the podcast, you and I. It's costing a lot of money. Is this a good use of money? You and I both think it is, but give us a quick answer.
I think this sort of project is a great sort of use of money. It builds super future capability for space. That it develops technology. It gives jobs to people. It builds skills, and it builds, a mission that is going to achieve great things scientifically, but also it builds an infrastructure that we can continue to grow, develop, innovate, and advance ourselves as a species.
I'm going to answer this one myself because we have said this already. Are they going to land? Why not? We talked about the equivalent of the Apollo missions. This one's testing various things, testing the human capability, life support systems, not planning to land. Artemis 4, hopefully 2028 is when they're hoping to land. They
will get some fantastic views of the far side of the moon, though, which is,
That's one of the things they're aiming for, isn't it?
First time that humans will have seen a lot of the features on that side as well.
Again, we've mentioned this briefly, but perhaps again, give us a quick answer. Why has it taken us so long to go back?
It's just because we weren't focused on it. So that's one of the reasons. We were focusing on other things, building an amazing space station, developing new rocket technology. But now we've decided now's the right time to go back with what we know, what we want to learn, and what the future of space exploration holds for us.
And one last one on this, and I suspect this might be slightly longer than a quickfire answer because it does build on what we've talked about. Artemis 2 specifically, what are the astronauts going to be doing? So we've already said they're testing systems. You talked about getting some great views of the far side of the moon. I think they're aiming to take photos of the South Pole, where we're aiming to land on Artemis 4, to get some more detailed information there. What else are the astronauts going to be doing? You talked already about it's quite an automated flight, a lot of this. So what specifically are the astronauts doing?
Their main focus is going to be monitoring the spacecraft. So testing the systems, ensuring everything works, gathering data, things like that. So for example, the very first thing they did when they got to space was test that the oxygen system and the toilets worked. Because if they don't, you've got to come back.
And there was a warning light in the toilet, wasn't there?
There was, They had a small hold on being able to use the toilet while they just troubleshooted some issues. But those are exactly the reasons why they're up there and why we've sent this crew along. Is to test all of these systems to make sure that in any eventuality, when we're using this to send crews regularly to the moon, then we know that it's going to work. We know how to fix these problems. So that's the prep.
And one of the bits that they've already done, which wasn't automated, was testing the manoeuvrability of the Orion spacecraft, wasn't it? So the Orion spacecraft they're in, which they've named Integrity for this mission, they did a manual test where once they separated from the final stage of separation before going to the moon, they did some manual manoeuvres, aiming at a target on the side of the propulsion system they'd separated from, and checking how easy it was to move around. Again, a really important test for future missions.
I mean, that's vital for the landing system. So you mentioned Artemis 3 is going to test these landing systems and actually do the rendezvous with them, but that's exactly what this test was preparing for.
So it was more or less a dry run for docking.
We know that this needs to happen, but we're not going to dock because we've not got the hardware to dock with, but can we manoeuvre as if we're going to? So super vital part of what we're doing for that mission.
So I think we've probably covered an awful lot of stuff there. Maybe sort of coming close to wrapping up, maybe if we both pick something we found really particularly interesting about this mission, and I'm going to pick one that you just mentioned, which is the toilet. And this is particularly in comparison with the Apollo missions. The Apollo missions, they didn't have a toilet.
No, they did not.
It was a much more cramped capsule for starters, so it was less comfortable capsule than they're in currently. Even the one they're in now is only about 5 meters across. It's about the size of a camper van, I think, with 4 of them in. But they have better comfort. They have the seats they were in for launch, where they're very much lying back so that they're on their backs for launch, coping with those G-forces. But those seats are movable, so once they're in space, they've moved into a more comfortable position. They've got a little exercise machine, like a rowing machine, but they also have a toilet. So on the Apollo missions, they used to use what we call fecal bags, little plastic bags. You'd do your business in the bag. There's a little place you can use your finger to guide things out if you need without the assistance of gravity. All a very, very unpleasant circumstance. And I think it was Apollo 10 when one of the bags leaked and something flew around the capsule that shouldn't have been there.
You're not doing wonders for astronaut recruitment, are you?
I'm not. However, that was in the 60s. And so
True.
now we have a toilet on board. So it's very similar to the ISS toilet, the International Space Station toilet. It's not quite as private, so they have to open a hatch in the floor, and it's just slightly away from the main area. But there is an actual toilet using suction pumps, exactly the same way as the ISS. I think that's really interesting. And again, talks about it's the wrong phrase. It's part of the wider thing of that this is building towards longer missions. In the past, the Apollo missions were very much, we're going to the moon, can we do it? Oh, they need to go to the loo, give them a bag. Now we can't have people doing their business in bags for a 3-year trip to Mars, so they've done it properly. And so I find that really interesting, that even in a pretty small capsule, which is very constrained for weight and for space, they've managed to fit in a very high-tech toilet.
I agree. I also think what's nice about that is it reminds of the mundanity of
totally,
stuff.
yeah.
Space is always this amazing thing. We're off to the moon. We've got these amazing technological rockets, but it's like, but everyone needs to go to the toilet. So how do we solve that problem? It's those little things that I think often people don't always think about, but actually is a really good reminder of, there's all these little things that you've really got to address, and figuring out ways to do that safely, but also comfortably, but also that fits within the scope of the mission, like you say, from size and weight and the technology you've got is something that's really fascinating.
So that was my particular point of interest. Anything that's particularly jumped out for you?
I found something that I found really exciting is, we talk about rockets, we talk about building rockets. We've seen a recent move to reusable rockets at the moment. And this one gets talked about as not necessarily being reusable, but that's not necessarily completely true. One of my favourite little facts that I found about the Artemis mission is one of the pieces of the rocket that has just taken off and is going on this amazing mission first went to space in 1982.
I didn't know that. Tell me about that.
So that is actually in fact, many of the bits of this rocket have actually been to space before.
Okay.
So the main 4 engines on the bottom of the big booster are actually space shuttle engines. So 3 of them have flown several missions.
Okay, I did see that.
With the space shuttle. One of them, I think, is built from spare parts and is new.
Yeah.
But was built, so that was technology used on the space shuttle. The same with the rocket boosters. So the solid rocket boosters are the same technology, the same solid rocket boosters that we used on the shuttle. And in fact, they were recycled, and one of the segments on one of the solid rocket boosters first flew on a really early shuttle mission in 1982.
That's really interesting.
And which really ties back to the space shuttle was designed to be reusable. It was never rapidly reusable. We're seeing rockets now landing, being refurbished in a couple of weeks and basically sent back up. The shuttle took a bit more than that. You had to bring these segments back, break them down, refuel them, refurbish them, and things like that. But that's still happening. And so one of those solid rocket boosters that's carried the astronauts on the way came from, like I say, 1982 with that first shuttle, which I think is incredible.
Yeah, that is
this
fantastic.
legacy is 40 years going on.
I'd missed that detail. That's excellent.
Again, and it's a reminder as well, we talk about this being modern technology. Rockets are super old and super basic.
Yeah.
We regularly talk to people that come and visit the Space Centre about rocket technology. Rockets were invented about 500 years ago, been just taking a tube and filling it with gunpowder. That's kind of how rockets are now. Like, it's a bit more controlled, and some of the extra mechanisms make it so that we can do that. But essentially, this is using very basic physics, very basic science that we can reuse in carefully controlled and managed ways, and with definitely with some refinement. But it's just I think that's a really nice simple reminder that these things, this is how it works and this is how it gets there, and we can reuse stuff.
Fantastic. Well, we're going to wrap up shortly, but one thing I think we should do, which we've been both of us remiss, we should name check the astronauts. So we mentioned Jeremy Hansen, a Canadian, the first non-American to go to the moon. But the other 3 on board, Reed Wiseman, the commander, Christina Cook, the first woman to go to the moon, and Vic Glover, the first person of colour to go to the moon. All 3 of those American astronauts, they're on their second space flight. They've each had a term on the ISS. Jeremy Hansen's on his very first space flight.
What a first mission,
I know, imagine
very
that.
jealous.
So those are the 4 astronauts, and obviously we wish them all luck in their mission so far.
Yeah,
it's
and I
gone
think
extremely well.
And we'll be able to tune in as well. I think what's really nice is I was going to say I was watching this morning. I wasn't because they're all asleep. But there's a really nice live feed from the Orion capsule. So I think that's the nice thing, is that, you know, people probably followed this at home. There's going to be so much opportunity over the next 10 days for people to tune in. You know, NASA have got a constant feed from the Orion capsule, and other than when the astronauts are probably using the toilet and when they're sleeping, and they'll have a bit of time to be private, but during many of those tests, you'll be able to tune in and watch these astronauts going through those procedures, giving that insight that people might have. You know, they'll be covering the vision of it as well. So there's a really nice visualization tool called NASA Arrow, which is showing live telemetry and showing the mission as it's going round. As you mentioned, they've got cameras, things like that, so they'll be taking images when it gets back. And so there's loads and loads of coverage. There's lots of space personalities that are covering. We're doing loads of events here as well that people can tune in and watch.
You're right, Josh. As you say, here at the National Space Centre, we're doing an awful lot of coverage. So if you follow the National Space Centre on Facebook or on YouTube, you can follow all the events we're doing. We're doing various live events here at the National Space Centre. We've got an archive interview with Stan Love, who's the Capcom, the communicator with the astronauts.
Yeah,
he came into the Space Centre a couple of years ago.
I had a little geeky moment. I heard him and I was like, I know him, I've met him.
I went to a talk
really,
again,
really nice
so you
guy.
can see that on our socials. Also, come into the centre. Okay, here at the National Space Centre in Leicester, we're doing all kinds of stuff. And even if it's not in the next few weeks, while the Artemis II mission is flying, there's all kinds of things here to see. We've got Moonrock. We have an incredible planetarium show, One Step Beyond, which touches on the Artemis programme, but then looks at what's going to happen beyond that. We've talked a couple of times today about the potential for going to Mars, and One Step Beyond is very much focused on what that might involve. So yeah, do visit us here at the National Space Centre. There's all kinds of things that tie in with Artemis that might keep you interested. Well, I think that probably brings us to an end. So thank you very much at home for listening, for watching. It's been an absolute pleasure to be back with you. Josh, it's been great to revisit, and we've not even mentioned Donald Trump.
Well, until the end there. But yeah, no, it's been great to see, and wonderful to watch this mission, share it with, the team here, and I can't wait for the next 10 days of seeing what happens, and then following that, the legacy of how that builds.
And the next few years.
Next few years, which is going to be super, super exciting for human exploration.
Perfect. Well, as you can probably tell, we're very excited about it. I hope it's got people excited at home as well. So thank you so much for joining us. Join us again next time we have an episode of Space Now.